Hi everyone, I'm Nadia, and in today's video I'm making mini resin beach art on a canvas. I'm using craft resin, which is my favorite resin to use, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio by volume, so I mix in equal parts of the A and B. I already prepped the back side of these canvases, and if you'd like more information on that process, I'll leave a video linked above. After I poured in equal parts of the A and B, I add them into a larger cup and mix well for about 5 minutes. You can continue mixing until you no longer see any streaks in your resin. I'll have a discount code for craft resin in my description if you'd like to give them a try. Once I'm sure my resin is mixed in well, I separate it into a smaller cup where I'm going to be adding in some pigment paste. And I'm using just Resin's pigment paste in the shade beige. I make sure to mix the pigment paste in the container first before adding some into my cup of resin. My plan here is to first add a layer of beige upon the entire area of the canvas. I love using these silicone mixing brushes because the resin peels right off, which makes them great to reuse. Once my pigment is mixed in well, I pour onto each canvas, and this will act as my base layer for my sand. I did run into a little obstacle here because while I was prepping my canvases for this pour ahead of time, I must have not propped them up well enough, and unfortunately they actually fell over, and this caused for my layer to not be entirely leveled. But this is something that can be corrected by adding more layers of resin to level out the surface. So because of this, you might be able to tell that the pigmented resin is gathering more in certain areas, and in general just isn't dispersing evenly. Another thing I should have done is painted the area a beige color before I poured on this layer of resin. I'm using my silicone makeup brush to make sure that the edges of the canvas are covered in resin as well. I allowed that to harden and came back the next day. Again, I mixed in my craft resin. After I separated it into smaller cups, I was ready to add in my pigments. And I'm going for a very minimalistic and transparent look. So the first pigment I'm going to be adding in is this mica powder from Let's Resin in the shade green. And in my next cup, I add in their mica powder in the shade cyan. I pour onto my canvas and again use a silicone makeup brush to help spread out the resin. I use a torch gun to pop any air bubbles. Again, I allow that layer to harden and come back the next day. As you can tell, there's a big part on the corner of one of my canvases which isn't leveled, and this is because of what I mentioned earlier. While prepping my canvas, it fell over and the resin on the backside went to one side, which unfortunately caused the surface of this canvas to not be leveled. But again, we will work through this. I mixed in my craft resin again, and to add a little bit more color and depth, I'm again mixing in the cyan mica powder. I add that near the top of the canvas and again spread it out using my silicone makeup brush. Below that area, I'm pouring some clear resin because in this layer I'm going to be adding on my waves. For my white pigment, I'm using just Resin's pigment paste, and once I have that mixed in well, I carefully apply it along the shoreline. And I use a heat gun to blow out the waves. Right after using the heat gun, I find that using a torch gun right after can help to open some of those cells. And I follow the same process on my second canvas. Again, I allow that layer to harden and come back the next day. Now I'm going to be working on adding a little bit more details and covering some imperfections. So the first thing I'm doing is taking some acrylic paint, and I use a combination of some white acrylic paint with a very small amount of this brownish acrylic paint, and I go over the sand area. And I'm doing this just to make sure that that area has a very nice and complete coverage. Then I take that same mica powder I've been using, and I'm using a paintbrush to brush some of that mica powder into that corner area where some pigment is missing. Once again, I mixed in my craft resin and added on another layer. Craft resin always leaves me with great results, and I especially love it because it has a very hard and clear finish. I thought I would be done there, but I wasn't entirely happy with how they turned out. Just as an experiment, I added on some leftover drops of resin that have flowed over the canvas on top of the canvas, and I thought that that could potentially look interesting. So I took Deppon's epoxy glue and glued on some of these resin drops onto the canvas. I'm still not entirely sure how I feel about this, whether I like it or not, but I ended up adding another layer of resin on top just to make sure that that's all sealed in well. And with my other canvas, I ended up adding on a little bit more pigment. I used the same technique that I showed earlier where I brushed on some mica powder directly onto the canvas, but this time I used a little bit of alcohol ink as well. And then I added another layer of resin just to seal that all in. All in all, this was a little experiment for me where I was just playing around and seeing what I liked, and here's the final product. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. Follow me on my Instagram, Summer Girl Designs, and my mom's Instagram, Wild Heart Resin Art.